But let's pray before we start. Is that okay? Lord, we're so grateful to be here in your city to discuss really this ancient plan that you have to bring restoration to the Jewish communities around the world and to bring them back to this land. And so we thank you that you've called us to be a part of this, even if we're just here visiting or touring. You've touched our heart. You've brought us to this city, and you have something in store for us. And I pray that you would bless every person here. Let their eyes be open to hear from your Holy Spirit how they can connect to what you're doing, Lord, to this miracle of restoration around the world. In Yeshua's name, amen. Well, my name is Nick Lesmeister. I'll give you a quick history about myself. I grew up in a Catholic home. I came to faith in the Lord when I was 19 years old, quite supernaturally, in a library in Fargo, North Dakota. And very odd place to meet Jesus, but that's where I met him. And from there, a lot of things happened. I ended up moving to Dallas, Texas, got involved with a church there called Shady Grove Church. And Shady Grove Church was sort of the ground that out of that came Gateway Church, if any of you are familiar with Pastor Robert Morris. And Shady Grove Church particularly had a heart for Israel. And while I was there, I became very connected to what they were doing to serve the Jewish people around the world, particularly through a ministry called the Messianic Jewish Bible Institute, which was sort of co-founded with Shady Grove Church and a number of other Messianic ministries from around the world in 1996. And the Messianic Jewish Bible Institute, MJBI, was led by a couple named Wayne and Bonnie Wilkes, and Wayne is actually right here in the back with us, Dr. Wayne Wilkes, who's now the executive pastor of Jewish ministry at Gateway Church. And he and I became very close friends through the years and traveled together, notably to Ethiopia. And it was in Ethiopia in 2011 that I had a life-changing experience with the Lord. And the Lord called me into Messianic ministry as a Gentile. I'd love to share you the whole story, but it's too much time would be taken up on that. And so Wayne and I began traveling together. Ultimately, I ended up moving to Jerusalem with my family in 2014, enrolled in the Hebrew University, which is up on Mount Scopus. If any of you went to the Mount of Olives and visited up there, you drove right past Hebrew University. And so I went there and got a master's degree in nonprofit management and leadership. And at the same time, Firm was being founded in the late 2014 period. And I became very close friends with Michael Mistretta, who's the COO of Firm. And interestingly enough, we lived in the same town in Texas for 5 years and never met. And it took us both moving to Jerusalem and becoming neighbors a block away from one another to finally meet. And we became very close friends. So I'm a member of the Firm Advisory Board. And I'm on the board for a couple of other Jewish ministries and then a couple of other missions-based nonprofits that are active around the world. So I have a heart for missions. I have a heart for Israel. God's called me to the Jewish people to serve them as a Gentile, stand with them. And I left a career as an entrepreneur of about 7 years, moved to Israel, and then was given an opportunity to take over for Dr. Wayne Wilkes to lead the Messianic Jewish Bible Institute. So I've been doing that for about 1.5 years. One of the places that we've been most active in is in Ethiopia and in other parts of Africa, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And if you read your brochure, which I'm sure you did because you found yourself here, you saw the title of my little session today, I Thought All the Jews Were White. And I don't know how many of you are in Israel for the first time. You've probably been asked that 1,000,000 times, but can you just raise your hand for me really quick? Okay. I'll be honest with you. I'll make the first confession. When I came and found out about the ministry to the Jewish community in Ethiopia in 2011, I was quite shocked. Because to me, a Jewish person was white, from Poland, right, or Brooklyn, and had a certain nose, was usually pretty pushy, and was very opinionated, and dressed a certain way, and talked a certain way. And so I was quite shocked to find out that there were Jews with darker colored skin. And then the Lord began to show me this whole world of these sort of, if you will, lost tribes of Jewish people from around the world that many people are very fascinated with, but that in basically the last 100 years have really become emergent Jewish communities that are recognized, some of them, by the government of Israel as a Jewish community. And that's why now today there are over 130,000 Ethiopian Jews that live in the land of Israel. So we're going to talk today really briefly about that, but I want to start by telling you a story first. many years ago, there was a Jewish man who lived here in Jerusalem, just maybe a couple miles down the road from here, not very far. And he inherited a great amount of wealth from his father. His father was a great man, but he turned his wealth over right before he died. His whole estate, he gave it over to his son. And his son actually was even wiser and shrewder than his father. And so he grew this estate into an even bigger estate. And he had notorious wisdom in his business dealings, in his dealings of all the ventures that he had. And he became quite famous in the region. He became so famous that another very wealthy person, a woman from a prosperous country in Africa, came to visit him. And she came because she had heard about how successful he was, and she wanted to meet with him. This was before the internet, and you could just Skype him. And meet with him and discuss, how have you done all these things? You're so wise. I want you to teach me some things. Well, she was so impressed with how wise this guy was that she brought with her this huge gift and gave to him in her gratitude this great gift. In fact, one of the gifts was over $180 million of gold. And so apparently this man was so moved by the gift that they procreated together and ended up having a son. That son's name, I'll tell you in a minute, ended up being called the son of the wise man. Well, this man's name was Shlomo HaMelech, or in English, King Solomon. The woman's name was the Queen of Sheba, and this happened in around the 900s BCs. And they had a son together, as legend is told. There's some evidence to this, but a lot of it is sort of just the oral tradition of the Ethiopians, named Menelik. Menelik became the first empire of the Solomonic Empire and dynasty in Ethiopia that actually lasted for over 3,000 years, 225 generations, and ended in 1974. That's how long this lasted. And so this is where many Ethiopian Jews today trace their lineage from, that this son of Solomon went back to Solomon before he died and was seeking a reconnection with his father, whom he never met. And Solomon actually, as some traditions hold it, gave him the Ark of the Covenant and had him take it to Ethiopia. And I'll get to more about this in a minute. So the Queen of Sheba and Solomon, this is one of the histories, and you can read about this. This is all true, and it's in the Bible, in 1 Kings chapter 10, minus the part about the son, but it talks about the Queen of Sheba coming and giving 9,000 pounds of gold, which in today's valuation would be about $180 million, and goes back to her kingdom. The kingdom, if you read in the Bible, it talks a lot about Cush, the C-U-S-H, the Cushite kingdom, or the Aksumite kingdom. All of these are the Ethiopian kingdoms, okay, that the Queen of Sheba was this great ruler over for a long time. So the other version of the Ethiopian Jewish lineage, if you will, from the people of Israel, is through one of the exiles. And in Jeremiah chapter 9, God says this. He says, "Because my people have forsaken my law, which I set before them, and have not obeyed my voice, nor walked according to it, but have walked after the stubbornness of their heart, I will scatter them around the world, in places they and their ancestors never heard of." Now, when God makes a promise, he delivers on it. And he, with the scattering of the Jewish people, really delivered well. He scattered the Jewish people to almost every country that you can think of, every continent that you can think of. And a lot of that happened through the three major exiles of the Jewish people. The first was the Assyrian Exile, which was the northern kingdom of Israel at the time, which is where the 10 tribes that are considered to be lost were living. And so the Assyrians came between 733 BC and 722 BC and took them into captivity into the north. And then after that came the Babylonian captivity, where the Babylonians in 597 BC to 586 BC then took Judah and Benjamin into captivity. And then, of course, the Roman exile, which was in 70 AD, as Yeshua predicted. The Romans came in, sacked the city, destroyed the temple, destroyed the city, and the Jewish people fled all over the place. So I have a very primitive map here. And if you can't figure it out already, someone told me it looks like a T-Rex, something eating something. This is Israel, okay? I haven't practiced my Star of David's for a while. Here's the land of Israel. This, of course, is Europe. So in these various exiles, the first one, like I said, it happened here. The Assyrians took them into the north. This was Assyria at the time. The second one, the Babylonians took them east to Babylon. And so to make it easy, just think of this, okay? ABP, okay? ABP, not ABC, ABP. The Assyrians got taken over by the Babylonians, got taken over by the Persians. And then, in around 538 BC, the Persians, Cyrus, lets the Jewish people come back to the land. So all this exile happens, but for the most part, it was all regional at the time. There was some trade that is talked about by different historians where the Jewish people were going into these different places. And of course, we know the Exodus coming out of Egypt. There were Jews in northern Africa, of course, for a long time. But these are the major exoduses. Now, after AD 70, everything really got flung wide. And what you ended up happening is because of the Roman Empire, there was so many trade routes between these parts of Europe and the Middle East and further and beyond. So you have the Jewish people then, after the Assyrian, Babylonian, and eventually the Persians, letting them come back into the land. The Jewish people move from here. They move over into, by boat. Paul talks a lot about his missionary journeys by boat. My marker just gave out on me. Moves over into Europe in these areas, okay? And then some of them carry on here into Spain. Many of them move along the northern part of Africa. So, like I said at the beginning, I thought all the Jews were white. This is where we get these ideas from, okay? Because the majority of Jews that we at the West would be familiar with are called Ashkenazi Jews, okay? There's two sort of, if you will, houses of Jewish religious, I don't know a better term for that, but basically two houses of the Jewish religion. One is called Ashkenazi, and one is called Sephardic, okay? Sephardic is named after the Iberian Peninsula, which at the time was called Safra, or Spain. So this became the hub of the Sephardic Jews right here, and then northern Africa as well. These are the Sephardic Jews here. There's another sort of subset of Sephardic Jews called the Mizrahi Jews, which means from the east. Those are typically the ones who remained in the Middle East at the time or moved back to the Middle East at some point. But it's mainly Sephardic and Ashkenazi. Ashkenaz is basically the word for Germany. So at some point around 1000 AD, the Jewish people kind of come up and settle in this Germanic area. And this is where you get what most of us are familiar with. If you walk around outside in Jerusalem and you see someone with a top hat and a black coat and a beard and tendrils and a black dress, most of them are going to come from this area, which was called the Pale of Settlement, which is Poland, Lithuania, sort of Western Russia, Ukraine in this area, because this is where the majority of Ashkenazi Jews were living. And so you have the Sephardic Jews here. They get kicked out of Spain in 1492 by the Catholic Church, and many of them moved back into northern parts of Africa, which were at the time Arab and Muslim areas, but they were offered peace to live there. Many of them came back to the Ottoman Empire, which actually even sent boats to bring them back to give them refuge. And so, but the Ashkenazi remained in this part of Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. And so that's kind of their history. That's the history of, if you will, the average Jewish person that comes to our mind when we think of a Jewish person, okay? And then eventually, of course, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, many of them began making Aliyah to Israel. Is everyone familiar with the term Aliyah? Basically, it means to go up, is essentially what it means, but it means to make return. It's a law in Israel that if you come from Jewish descent, you can immigrate and become a citizen of Israel. So, where does that fit in with these African communities? Well, like I said, one of the traditions with the Ethiopians is that they had a son, the Queen of Sheba had a son, and that started this Jewish community in the northern part of Ethiopia. But then the other, which is the one I'm more familiar with in being in ministry in Ethiopia, is that around the time of the split of the northern kingdom, somewhere between 900 BC and I would say maybe like 600 BC, there was a tribe of Dan, which was a part of the northern 10 tribes, and some of them didn't like what was happening in like the civil infighting between the northern 10 tribes and then the southern 10 tribes of Judah and Benjamin. So they left and made their way down into this kingdom, this Ethiopian kingdom. So they would have come down this way and settled in the northern part of Ethiopia in an area that is now most known by a town called Gondar, which is a very modern big town. And this is where today the hub of what is known as the Beta Israel live. So the Beta Israel is the Ethiopian Jewish community. So that's how they trace their history to coming down into Ethiopia. And they were there for many years. And in fact, in the 17th century, some estimates say that there were around 1 million of them living in Ethiopia, and they were speaking Hebrew. There's accounts of Hebrew language being spoke by these Ethiopian Jews. And so by and large, the majority of the, kind of typical Jewish world didn't really know that much about them, but there was some talk about them. People were going and visiting them. And in about 1908, actually, 45 chief rabbis of different countries collectively said, we recognize the Jews of Ethiopia as Jews. But this was before the land of Israel, was officially established. The state of Israel, was officially established. And the rest of the Jewish community sort of kind of turned their back against this. And then in 1921, when this area was still British Mandate Palestine that we're in today, the first chief rabbi, Ashkenazi chief rabbi, remember Ashkenazi here, mainly, big A, and then this is Sephardic. The first chief rabbi's name was Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook. There's a street named after him right down Jaffa Street. You could go and look at it. I actually lived on that street for a year. He signed a letter and recognized the Ethiopian Jews in 1921. And then kind of things keep moving and moving. Of course, the state of Israel is formed in 1948. And finally in 1975, the government of Ethiopia recognized the Ethiopian Jews and says, you're a Jewish community, you can make return to the land of Israel and become citizens. So, in 1948, the government secretly airlifted about 14,500 Jews in an operation called Operation Moses, where many of the Jewish people were fleeing a civil war in Ethiopia. They went to a refugee camp in Sudan, and the government of Israel didn't tell anyone about this, and they landed planes in the desert and picked up 14,500 of them and took them to Israel. One of my very dear friends was in that camp. He actually left to go get something, go back to a town where everyone was there. He came back to the camp a few weeks later. Everyone was gone. And so he lives in Ethiopia to this day, actually. But God's called him to something different. So our ministry, the MJBI, we currently are active amongst these Jewish communities, the Beta Israel community, and then in the Beta Israel community, there's two subset communities in Ethiopia, one called the Beta Abraham, which is in the capital city of Addis Ababa, and then another called the Gafat Beta Israel, which is in the south of Ethiopia. And if I have some time at the end, I'll share some more stories about them. It's pretty interesting. So today, we have, as far as the believing community, we have 12 Messianic congregations in Ethiopia. We've graduated about 500 students from our 2- and 1-year discipleship schools in Ethiopia, and they're actually working to have the world's very first Messianic Jewish denomination. In America, mainly, we have Messianic Jewish alliances or unions of congregations that are sort of together, but this would be a denomination that would table with other evangelical denominations. So we're seeing really a real revival happening in Ethiopia. I mean, if you think, they had received official recognition in 1975, and now we're seeing all of this explosive things happening with them coming to faith in Yeshua and really celebrating their Jewishness after many years of being in the dark. Another group that we're working with is actually in Zimbabwe. They're called the Lembeh, L-E-M-B-A. And their history is even equally as fascinating. They're in South Africa, mostly in Zimbabwe. Estimates range them around 70,000 to maybe as much as 200,000. They trace their history, now this is very, very interesting, to coming back from the Babylonian captivity in 538 BC. And actually, they say you can read about this in Ezra chapter 10, when Ezra goes out to particularly the Levites who came back to the land and says, hey, some of you took foreign wives when you were in captivity, and you need to give them up to come back into the camp. This is what God's instructing. Well, the Lembeh claim that 7 of their elders refused to do this, and they left. They split the camp. They went down into Yemen, essentially, and archaeologists, the Lembeh claim that they built a city there, that there's some archaeological discovery on that, and then they sailed down the coast into Mozambique, into Zimbabwe, settled there, and lived Jewish lives. So to this day, the Lembeh tribe practices circumcision for males. They eat kosher. They kill their own meat in a kosher way. In fact, I remember I was there in 2014, and one of these Lembeh guys, he had a kippah on, and he had this huge knife on him. And I said, are you scared of like a cobra or something? He said, no, it's because I kill all of our meat. I kill it myself in a kosher way. They practice Shabbat, and there's been a huge resurgence or a huge interest in figuring out who these people are, because by and large they've been a very closed group. They're very tribal, and they're very structured in their tribal society. And so a man named Tudor Parfit, who's a researcher from the United Kingdom, who's Jewish, started looking into these guys in the late 90s and hearing about them. And basically he did some DNA testing. And we don't have to get too scientific here, but there is basically a Y chromosome haplotype, okay, that is a marker. Each of us have a marker in our DNAs. And this is how we sort of trace where we came from and, what part of the world we came from, etc. So there's a specific Y chromosome haplotype called the Cohen modal haplotype, CMH, okay? And Cohen, for those of you who don't know, is essentially the Hebrew word for priest, so a descendant of the priestly line. And as we know, there were strict regulations for the Levitical priesthood for who they could marry, who they couldn't marry, etc. And so this researcher found that in a subset of the Lembeh, who essentially claimed to be descendants of this priestly line, that 50% of them had this CMH marker, which is actually higher than a broader Jewish population. That if you took a same sample size, it's actually higher. So this began this huge sort of explosion as, wow, the Lembeh are really one of the lost tribes. And so they then get a lot of international attention, especially in the Jewish world. A lot of people have been going and doing research with them. We started working with them in 2011 through our partner organization called Jewish Voice Ministries International with Rabbi Jonathan Bernis. And Wayne actually was there and went in 2012 and met with one of the chiefs. And he said, Messianic Judaism is our religion. It's the religion of the Lembeh, and we've been Jewish this whole time. And many of them actually become Christian, but they would say Christianity is my religion, Judaism is my culture. That's what they would say. And so at the time, there were no Messianic Jewish congregations amongst the Lembeh in 2012, and today there are 60, with 2,500 Lembeh meeting on Shabbat in congregations or home groups. And we've graduated 140 graduates from our Bible school since 2014. And in September, we're starting a 3-year undergraduate program in Messianic Jewish theology, where at the end of 3 years, the Lembeh students will know modern Hebrew fluently. They're going to go through 6 levels of modern Hebrew. So what we're seeing with the Lembeh, what we're seeing with the Ethiopian Jewish communities, really at the end of the day, it comes back to this. When we started this conference on Tuesday night, I don't know if you remember this or not, Wayne Hilson talked out of Ezekiel 36, particularly out of Ezekiel 36, I think 22 through 24. And the theme of this conference is that the world may know that I am the Lord. And what is the verses preceding that? Is basically God saying, to honor my name, I will bring you back to this land, so that the world will know that I am the Lord and that I am faithful to my promises. And so when you look through the word and you see that God promised to scatter his people, and he did that, we know that if God can scatter, and only God does, if we all will say God was the one who scattered the Jewish people, because it's undeniable that happened, we have to say undeniably that it is only God who can regather the Jewish people, and that God will gather them from the corners of the earth, where he knows they've been scattered to. So if you look now in, you can just write this down and look it up later, in Isaiah chapter 11, verses 11 through 12, I'll read you this verse. In that day, the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to bring back the remnants of his people, those who remain in Assyria and northern Egypt, in southern Egypt, Ethiopia, and Elam, in Babylonia, Hamath, and the distant coastlands. He will raise a flag among the nations and assemble the exiles of Israel. He will regather the scattered people of Judah from the ends of the earth. And this is something I'm particularly passionate about, because a lot of times, we have to combat some wonky arguments when we have a love for Israel or a love for the Jewish people, right? And one of the ones that I think is the most crazy is some of my family members will say this. Oh, the state of Israel was a man-made thing in 1948. The world felt bad because they were in the Holocaust and so much terrible things happened to them. So they just said, we'll just make you a state where you can live in peace. Well, the problem with that is that on the eve of World War II, there were 475,000 Jews who, in 5 different waves of Aliyah in the previous about 70 years, had come back to this land, making up 40% of the population of, at that time, British Mandate Palestine on the eve of World War II. Okay? So you can't say that the Jews started coming back to the land of Israel because there was a state set up for them. You can say they started coming back to the Israel because God was regathering them. And just as he was regathering them from these places, he's regathering them from the other places where they've been lost, where they've been hidden, and he's bringing all this to light because he is coming soon. And these things need to be set up. These things need to happen. His promises need to be fulfilled before we can see the return of Yeshua as the Messiah to bring restoration to Israel and the nations. So, let me end with this verse. Jeremiah 31, verse 8. See, I will bring them from the land of the north and gather them from the ends of the earth. Among them will be the blind and the lame. Now listen to this. Expectant mothers and women in labor. A great throng of people will return. Now, I mentioned before the Ethiopian Aliyah and Operation Moses, which was in 1984, and Operation Solomon, which is a subsequent one in 1991 that also brought about 15,000 Jewish people. In 1984, 27 airplanes were in the air at the same time, bringing Jewish people to the land of Israel. They did this in like 36 hours, almost 15,000 people. They set a world record for having 1,087 people on a Boeing 747. And there were 5 births on board one of the planes from Ethiopia to Israel. So God is faithful to his word down to the very word of it. When he said, I will bring women in labor, he literally meant it. I'm bringing women in labor to come back to the land of Israel. So one plane took off with 100 people and landed with 105. Is that amazing? So guys, this is exciting because what we're seeing is a restoration of the Jewish people, a restoration of Jewish identity, but we're also seeing a restoration of the remnant of the Jewish people who are believers, who are coming to faith in their Messiah, making Aliyah, and are in this land representing the name of Yeshua and giving credit to the fact that God's true to his word. And you being here get to be a part of that, and you get to experience that. So when you see an Ethiopian walking down the street here, or even one that I didn't mention, the B'nai Moshe from India, a Jewish group from India. There's a recognized Jewish group from China. And you see these cultures all over Israel. I think there's over 35 nationalities represented in this country. It's the highest per capita immigrant-absorbing nation in the world. We're living in the midst of a miracle. And you guys, especially us who are under the age of 40, we are going to see the further explosive growth of these things in the next few years of our lives because the clock is speeding up. And so it's exciting to be a part of this. And as you see the context of what's God doing, I pray that it would encourage you that God is faithful to his word. And when you read his word, you can count on him delivering on his promise because he's faithful to the Jewish people. And just like it says in Exodus 36, that the world may know that I am the Lord. This is a sign of his faithfulness, his ancient faithfulness, that over thousands and thousands of years, he is bringing his people back when, for many years, no one knew about them, they didn't know where they were, or they thought they were forgotten. In fact, I'll tell you one last quick story. When Wayne went to Ethiopia in 2010, I think it was, and he went to meet with one of the elders of this Jewish community, and one of the elders confided in him and said, for 700 years, the fathers of our community have told us God will send someone to restore our Jewish identity. For 700 years, our fathers have told us this. And he told Wayne, he pointed at him, he said, you are the man that God has sent to restore our Jewish identity. And they were sitting under this huge acacia tree, and it was like almost right after this happened, I think, the clouds broke, this huge clap of thunder, and it started pouring down rain. And what we're seeing, in particular in Ethiopia and Zimbabwe, is this incredibly joyful restoration of identity around the world. And when we know our true identity, then we can walk in confidence and power of the Holy Spirit to fulfill the callings that God's given us. So I want to leave just a couple of minutes, probably about 5 minutes or so for questions. If you guys have any, I know I blew through a lot of information, so go ahead.
So when you said that from Spain they went back to Israel, didn't they also go to the Americas?
Correct.
Like I'm Puerto Rican?
Yeah.
And we're finding that there's, like in our textbooks years and years and years ago, they used to say that we came from Spain and we're Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
and they took it out for political reasons.
Sure.
How do you go about, because I have to go back and like test my great-great-grandmother, and
Yeah.
how do you go about doing that? Do you just don't do anything and let the Lord bring
Well, I'll say this: there's people working on your behalf. We're very close friends with some people who are in Brazil. And what happened here, really brief history, Catholics kick out the Jewish people, basically, or force them to convert in 1492. Many of them go to Portugal. They live there for a very short period of time with freedom, and then the Portuguese really double down on the persecution. And from there, they essentially go to the Portuguese colonies. Many of them are in South America or in Central America. And some of them go as forced converts to Christianity. Some of them go as Jews, but then the Portuguese follow them there, and they can, the church history is very unfortunate in a lot of ways. That to say that Spain, I think just 2 years ago, issued the fact that if you can prove that you have descent from the community that was kicked out, they'll give you Spanish citizenship. But we have some very good friends that have set up the very first museum of the Inquisition in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, and they are basically it's a people group called the Anusim. Those who the sort of derogatory term for that is Marranos, but Anusim is really the proper term to use, and they're the ones who were forcefully converted to Catholicism mostly, and now are returning to their Jewish identity. Okay, Morenos, yeah, sure, yeah. And so what's happening now is that the Jewish community is really, just like they are with the Lembeh, coming a little bit more around to the fact that there really are people of Jewish descent who are returning to their Jewish roots, maybe, or who never left them, and recognizing that this is a legitimate group of Jewish people. So that's a good question, though. Yeah. Not that I really know. I mean, just blanket statement. There are genealogy tests you can do, DNA tests that you can do that can show if there's some markers, genetic markers or geographic markers. A lot of people will do them. It's not enough. That's not something that you would use, of course, to really prove to any community that you have a Jewish heritage. But I don't discourage people from taking them. We all want to know where we come from and what our mixture is, because it helps us know who we are today. And so, but you can take some things like that. Yeah. It could show you, essentially what it shows you is sort of descent. And it traces descent back to areas. And a lot of times those areas then are traced to Jewish communities or areas where there was a large population of Jewish people. Yeah. So, which is really what the Lembeh DNA testing showed too. They were looking for Middle Eastern markers in their DNA. And they found this CMH marker in the Y chromosomes, only of the males though. But because they've been very strict about intermarriage. So. You had a question, I think?
Yeah, I've been in Brazil for basically about 30 years, so this is very interesting. Is there a place where I can go get more information on this?
Yeah, it's...
I do want to confirm from that the initial things that I've been able to find out is perhaps 20% or more of the Brazilian population has these, like the names in the
right.
Inquisition, the names were changed.
Yeah.
And so you have like Oliveira.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I'll write this down. It's called the Museum. I don't know what it is in Portuguese. Of the Inquisition. And it's in Belo Horizonte. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the largest evangelical church, Lagoinha Baptist Church. They're right in Belo Horizonte.
Yeah. So.
By the way, from that church, she's going to be
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're very friendly with the Messianic congregation that is one who started this museum. So, yeah. Yeah.
So, in terms of all the Jewish people making Aliyah here, has it been recognized by the Israel state that there are, like the Lembeh and the different other tribes? Are they able to make that same return?
The Lembeh are not recognized right now. The Beta Israel are recognized, and the B'nai Moshe from India are recognized. And I don't know, Jennifer, do you know of a couple of other smaller groups? There are quite a few smaller ones. Those are the main. That's the main ones, yeah. And the Falashamura, which, yeah, of the Beta Israel, they were the forced converts to Orthodox Christianity in Ethiopia, the Falashamura. So yeah, no, this is a kind of a work in progress. Yeah.
Are they able, because they can't really prove their
right.
culture?
Yeah, right now, there are a lot of groups I haven't talked about in Africa that are claiming Jewish roots. There's an Igbo tribe in Nigeria that claims Jewish roots. There's a group in Uganda that claims Jewish roots. There's many in other different places. Some of them have a little bit of a weaker oral tradition, especially through the ages, to prove that. These are really the main ones that have sort of caught the eyes of researchers who are really doing a lot of research on this and are coming up with things that support their oral tradition. But we're kind of in, again, sort of the beginning stages of a lot of this just in the last 50 years.
I have another question. I don't know if you've heard of any of this, but there's a big Hebrew movement in America,
Mm-hmm.
the black community,
Mm-hmm.
and saying, and it just, I would like to hear your thoughts because I have friends and I don't know how to address it, but I'm like, basically they're saying that, and it does kind of line up the history of slavery and how
Mm-hmm.
there were tribes around this certain different tribe, and they sold this tribe
Mm-hmm.
into slavery, and they came to America.
Yeah.
And there's a big movement of Hebrew. I mean, some of it's not really good because
Sure.
like the white people in Israel are alive, we're the
Yeah.
true ones. But
Yeah.
what do you think about?
Well, that's a good question. It is a touchy one. Like I said, the majority of those claims are going to be from this tribe in Nigeria called the Igbo tribe. They number around 60 million, and they really have a huge diaspora, which is a scattered community in the world. And again, their kind of claims to Jewish identity are from an oral history. And I know our sister organization, Jewish Voice, is doing some really extensive research on whether or not these claims hold up. But most of the research that has been done by scientists so far has been, more on the whatever legitimate claim. So, but then there's that. There's sort of a Hebraic movement where, that gets into more a little bit towards the margins of all this as well, where I identify with the Jewish people. I identify with particularly the Exodus. Actually, Kalev Myers, one of the speakers yesterday morning, wrote a book about this. I'd encourage you to get it. Yeah. So yeah.
What you mentioned more in terms of Ephraim and Manasseh and just even the whole question of the 12 tribes. I think of Israel as well. Israel is like one tribe.
Yeah.
And then there's the rest of the world. But Israel and its foundation is part of the inclusive tribe already at the beginning.
Yeah.
The story of Joseph going into Egypt and the Egyptian-born grandkids. Ephraim and Manasseh are already Egyptian-born. And so in a certain sense, Israel is already inclusive in the very beginning. Different mothers, since they have all this mix already in the beginning. So, when we talk about Israel trying to form what is Israel,
Yeah.
Israel already in itself from the very beginning is inclusive.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that'll be the last question. We got to wrap this up. I'll just say that there's a lot you can read on this, and from my point of view, the research tends to be all over the board, and a lot of groups like to use the lost tribes as a means of trying to kind of get a route into Jewish identity. Most of the times, those are I would say unsuccessful in the sense of from a scientific proof or even a historical proof. But only God knows this. I mean, Josephus wrote in the first century that he talked about this large group of Jewish people still living beyond the Euphrates, which would have been over here in Babylon, who would have probably been a part of the Assyrian captivity. So this is where over the hundreds and thousands of years things sort of get muddled. But I think God will make it all clear in the end, just like he kind of has in the last 100 years. Some of these things have come to light. So I'll be available if you guys want to have any more questions. I can step outside. Otherwise, thank you for your attention. I really enjoyed it. And have a great rest of your conference. Yeah, thanks.